In this video I'd like to talk about the importance of using a tension swatch and checking that you're knitting to the correct recommended gauge for your knitting pattern. But also I want to talk about a more creative side of tensions and how we can be creative and mess around with the needles we're using, the yarns we're using to create all sorts of different types of fabric. So here we go. So for example, we've got a ball of the Women's Institute Soft and Silky here. It's a 100-gram ball of 4-ply. All the information you need is on the label. If you turn it over, you'll see a guide for the recommended needle size to knit this yarn in this case it's 3.25mm needle, and you'll also have a guide which shows you how many rows and how many stitches you need to knit in stocking stitch to get a 10 times 10 centimetre swatch. So in this case you need to cast on 25 stitches and knit 36 rows, and that will give you 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres. I've done the recommended swatch, but as you can see I've actually knitted a few more stitches on either side and a few more rows, and I've marked where the recommended number of stitches and number of rows falls. This makes it easier to measure. Now if you haven't got a blocking board, you can just as easily do this on the carpet without creating too much damage. So if you just pin out your swatch, it's a lot easier to measure. Like so. You can obviously put more pins in to get a flatter swatch, but now if you get your ruler you can measure in between the two markers between there and there to get you 10 centimetres. Okay, so you know that that's accurate, the way you knit is accurate, and then you can measure the number of rows, which shows you there between the two markers is 10 centimetres. So you know that the way you knit is not too loose, it's not too tight, and you can get an accurate gauge or an accurate swatch going on the gauge that they've given you. As another example, I've chosen to use a chunky yarn, and I've knitted up the tension swatch recommended on the label. The yarn's a bonus chunky, it's a 100-gram ball again, and on the back, the same as the first one, you'll see all the information you need to knit your tension swatch. You've got your needle size, which in this case is a 6mm needle, obviously a bigger needle because it's a chunkier yarn than the last one, and then you've got your 10 by 10 centimetre stocking stitch gauge with recommended number of rows and number of stitches to knit. So again, what I've done here is I've knit a few more stitches each edge, and I've knit a few more rows, and then I've marked as I've been going along where the recommended rows and stitches should fall. I've measured my swatch and it is accurate, it's 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres. If you were to find that you were slightly bigger or slightly smaller than the recommended 10 centimetres, then you'd have to look at altering the size of your needle and either using a smaller needle to get a smaller tension, a smaller swatch, or a larger needle to get a larger swatch. So that's what you'd need to do there. So here's another example to show you, a little bit different. In this case I've created a fabric out of two different yarns, neither of which I've got the tension gauge for. So I'm having to create my own tension swatch to get the measurements and then go on to write the pattern. What I've done, this is done on the machine as well as opposed to knitted by hand. I've cast on 60 stitches and I've made a mark 20 rows up and then another 20 rows up, and then I've gone on to do 60 rows. I've also made a mark 10 stitches in, 10 stitches in, so that's out of 60 stitches 40 stitches where the mark comes, 20 either side of your centre knot. So I've created a swatch there where I can measure the distance between 20 rows and 40 stitches quite accurately, and then I can do my calculations from those marks. The other thing to mention here is if you're using a yarn which you're going to block before you actually sew up, it's better to block it first. Number one, because you get a more accurate measurement between your markers, and number two, it's easier to measure because it's nice and flat on your blocking board. Okay, I also put a little note pinned to my swatch telling me how many stitches, how many rows, what tension I've used on the machine and which yarns I've used. And then if it is a period of time before I come to use the tension guide, the tension swatch, then I've marked what I actually did and which yarns I've used and what tension I was using. Okay, so that's that one. So going back to using a yarn where you've got the recommended gauge, like we saw earlier, that's using the recommended needles. Now if you were knitting a pattern which recommends those needles and that yarn, and you've got the correct tension swatch knitted out and you know that it's accurate, then you would go ahead and follow the pattern and know that you were going to end up with the correct size of garment, whatever that garment might be. But I like to play. I love to play with tensions, and I love to be creative with tensions. And what I've done in this case, I've used the same yarn, but I've used much smaller needles. Instead of a 6mm needle, I went down to a 3.25mm needle, which was the one we used for the previous 4-ply yarn. And as you can see, the swatch that I've knitted the same number of stitches, the same number of rows, but I've got a much smaller swatch and much tighter stitches, and that's what I like about this fabric. It's a really stiff fabric I've created with the nice tight stitches, and actually this sort of fabric is ideal for knitting hats because you get that stiffness that you need to hold the hat into shape. Now you could go in the opposite direction, and instead of being creative with thick yarn and fine needles, you could get creative with fine yarn and large needles. Now that's the original sample I showed you with the recommended needles for the 4-ply yarn, but look what big needles have created. Same number of stitches, same number of rows, but look at that gorgeous floppy fabric. Absolutely gorgeous. Ideal for scarves. I'd like to show you a couple of examples where I've gone against the recommended gauge and I've used a thick yarn with very thin needles to create a beautifully thick, stiff fabric which is ideal for hats. This is my black hat. As you can see, it keeps its shape very nicely, and of course every girl's got to have a pink hat. So here's my pink one, and again you can see how it keeps its shape nicely because the fabric is so thick and heavy, and it looks like this. Perfect. And here's an example where I've used very thick needles and a very fine yarn. So again, I've gone against the recommended gauge to produce a beautifully floppy scarf fabric. Very loose stitches, and it hangs absolutely gorgeously. But we must remember that if we're following a pattern and we want to get the correct size that the pattern is stating, then we need to do our tension swatch and we need to use the correct recommended needles and yarn, test our tension swatch, make sure it comes out to the correct measurements, and then follow the pattern and know that you're going to get the correct size. But there's nothing wrong with being a little bit creative sometimes. Bye for now.